on this page, where it says Creation of the Leviathan Force and related history. This gives you a basic idea of a little bit of what came before, just a real rough rundown. We have 250 million years ago, a angelic human seeding one took place on parallel Earth, and they were called the Palladorian cloisters. 25 million years ago, the 5 Palladian cloister races were seeded on Earth over here. So we've been here for 25 million years. 5,500,000 years ago, human seeding 1 on Earth was destroyed in the electric wars. 3,700,000 years ago, human seeding 2 was started. 848,800 years ago, human seeding 2 was destroyed via the Thousand Years' War. And all of these wars, guess who they were with? It's like the same beings. It was the Anu Elohim and the fallen Draconian races versus the Emerald Covenant races. And it was all about Templar quest, which is territorial quest for the Stargates. But it wasn't just Stargates on one planet. It was Stargates in this whole 15-dimensional time matrix that they were after. Now, 798,000 BC, we had the 5 Palladi-Urtite cloister races were seeded here. This was seeding 3, the beginning of seeding 3. You can read, because I'm not going to go into talking just about our seedings. What I want to do is get to the Leviathan races. Just know from 798,000 BC, that was the beginning of our 3rd seeding, and our races progressively, were put here, the angelic human and the indigo races. Then, there were a couple of other things that happened where between 669,000 BC and 250,000 BC, there were the Rama and the Templar Wars, and these were a mess. You had Anunnaki and Draconian invasions from all over, spaceship invasions. Things coming in with like sonic beams, photosonic beams that could make matter dematerialize when it got hit with it. Big wars, that kind of thing. We had a race of pre-Leviathan fallen angelic hybrid things called the Nephidim. They were Draconian, and another called the Urantia. These were Jehovian Anunnaki hybrids. These were the beginning of the Illuminati races. The Illuminati races were upgraded from this point and merged with something else. Now, that I'll talk about in a minute. In this period of the Rama and Temple Wars, the races, the Nephidim and the Urantia races, were not able to fully procreate with angelic human races. They were originally created through forced laboratory experimentation in some of the earlier seedings. And in some of the earlier seedings, in seeding 2, there was an experiment done, again, a bioregenesis experiment to try to help the fallen ones, that allowed natural procreation between the angelic human races and a certain small collective of fallen ones supposed to be not, wanting to get out of being fallen. And that turned into absolute disaster. That's where we ended up with a seed race that went on, and they took it off planet. The fallen angelics took it off planet, and it became kind of like a core genetic template to upgrade their progressive building of a master invader race. Now, we learned our lesson in seeding 2, so we're going to do that again right away. And in seeding 3, the angelic human races and the indigo races were created in a way that they could not naturally hybridize, naturally procreate with any of the fallen angelic forces, which gave them protection from the fallen angelic forces. In 250,000 BC, there was a period of time where you had what are called the Palladian, Nibiru, and Anunnaki races. They're from Nibiru and from the Pleiades star system. These were the guys that in Sumerian history came down as Enki and Enlil and Marduk. Those gods. Yeah, they were gods. They were race lines that, when we get into the genealogies, that we won't get too heavily into today, but these were race lines of fallen angelic Anunnaki races. Some of them crossed with one thing, some of them crossed with another. The Enki, Enlil, and Marduk races, Anunnaki races, were considered, what do they call them? You had the Jehovian, there's a name, the Anu Seraphim. These were called the Anu Seraphim Anunnaki races. They weren't the original strain. The original strain were Anu Elohim, out of the Giovanni crew, and they were called the Jehovian Anunnaki races. The Jehovian Anunnaki races looked at themselves as the true, pure strain Anunnaki, and they didn't like the other ones. The other ones had crossed with various ones of the fallen Seraphi, be it draconian ones or some of the things that the draconians had created. So the Pleiadian Nibiruan Anunnaki races are Anunnaki races that have partial Seraphi or draconian type coding. You have the Enki, Enlil, Marduk groups. What were the full names of those? They're in Voyages, Volume 2. The Enki Zephelium. Okay, Enki Zephelium races, the Enlil Odedicron. Okay, so if you look at the Enki Zephelium, now Zephelium are one of the fallen races that are connected to the Zeta races that we talk about now. And they were a reptilian snake type cross. Okay, so they took Anunnaki, which was a core Anunnaki, was an aquatic ape. All right, that was the original form. An aquatic ape hominid was the original Anunnaki form. So you take that and you cross it with, for an Enki family line, they would crossed it with the Zephelium. So it's Enki Zephelium. That's the Toth line. All right, now Toth is a Nibiruan Anunnaki. He was out of the Enki family. Okay, now Enlil crossed with Odedicron, so they call him the Enlil Odedicron. Now that would be a more reptilian, fully reptilian, as opposed to snake, more of a reptile, think salamanders and things. Okay. Then you have the Marduk group, which crossed with Omicron, which were the dragon moth people and the Dinoids. So these are the Anu Seraphim Anunnaki races. And they've forever been trying to get the territory here. These are the ones that set up the Nibiruan Datic crystal grid in 25,500 BC. But way back in 250,000 BC, they were coming in here speculating for various things. One of the things they were speculating for was gold, because they had depleted Nibiru's resources of organic gold. Now they used gold in a very specialized way. They, through laboratory ionization, they call it, they create what's called, in contemporary terms, and it used to be called this in Egypt too, white powder gold, which is a substance that has the ability to create, let's say, electrical sparks within the atomic structure that allow more energy to be pulled in from the field around you, so it assists in sustaining immortal life. Not eternal life, but immortal life. There's a difference. You don't want to be immortal. Eternal, yes. Immortal, there are better things to do. But because they were running out of natural gold in their planetary system, and the Pleiadian system was devoid of it, it didn't have any to mine, Earth was very rich in organic, elemental gold. They literally, on Nibiru, once they created Nibiru in a way where it was in its artificial orbit, and it's an orbit that runs partially through the Phantom Matrix and then back up through our gates and into our system. It used to be in our system completely, but when it fell, they created an orbit that runs between the two systems, and every 3,657.8 years it cycles back through. So to sustain their atmosphere, they had literally changed their atmosphere, and you found a way to imbue this elemental gold ionized particulate structure into this white powder gold substance into their atmosphere, so they breathed it. And after many generations of that, it sustained the Metatronic body, is what it did. It helped to sustain the Metatronic body. After many generations of this, they couldn't survive without it. And there was all sorts of mutations happening on their planet with their peoples because they were running out of the amounts of gold needed to create this in the atmosphere. So they were on speculation journeys, trying to find places where they could rob more gold from. And this is where we got our original value of gold, actually, why it's so important. That was an Anunnaki trait. It's very important to the Anunnaki races because it helps them to sustain their immortal status in their bodies. And now that their bodies are mutated fully into the Metatronics, if they don't have some degree of that frequency that's created through white powder gold in their systems, they begin to rapidly deteriorate. Their physical forms rapidly begin to deteriorate, and their consciousness begins to fragment because they don't have a soul structure anymore that they're directly connected to. So in 250,000 BC, you had the Enki, Enlil, and Marduk, Pleiadian, Nibiru, and Anunnaki coming in and attempting to mine gold. And they started warring with each other because nobody liked to work the mines. And it was like, well, why should we work the mines? You work the mines. And they started to war with each other. So they decided to end that war amongst themselves. They were going to create a slave race, a slave race that would do the mining for them. And we were on the planet at the same time. The angelic humans and the indigos were. And we were in, like, certain parts, usually associated with the Stargate and the Q-site locations. They were always our seeding grounds. And there are lots of raids by these guys trying to, grab humans and do things with them. But they decided to create, they didn't want something as intelligent as an angelic human, because you're not going to control it, basically. They wanted something a cross between an animal and something that had some degree of intelligence where you could put it on autopilot and it would do what you told it to. So they created a race called the Lulcus. They created the Lulcus by taking their own imprint, their aquatic ape hominid imprint, and combining it with the gene code, a small portion of the genetics of angelic humans that had been captured in their raids. And they did it in a laboratory. They created it in a laboratory, like our scientists are starting to play around now. And they combined it with the angelic human, their aquatic ape, and I believe two other. One was an ape-like strain of animal from Nibiru, and the other was a monkey strain. It was a strain of monkey primate from from this planet. And what they came up with, or what we call, our scientists call, the Neanderthal. That was the beginning. And that's where the Neanderthals fit in. These had nothing to do with human evolution. They weren't a part of it at all, but boy, have they tried to put Darwinian theory in there, so we start to think of ourselves as them. All right, so they created the Lulcus Neanderthal. They were called the Lulcus. They were a primate hominid slave race, and they were able to create them, and they had a certain sophistication of intelligence, even though other ways they were very slow-witted compared to what a human is now, even now as Homo sapiens. But they had genetics that had a little bit of the angelic human imprint because of the part that they had literally robbed from the gene code. It's like grabbing a body, killing the person, but taking part of the DNA and using a select part of that DNA to cross it with other DNA. This is how they did it, is laboratory messing. All right, so that created the slave races of the Neanderthal. In 246,000 BC, there was, and this was like the beginning of a new wave of evolution after the Rama Wars and the Temple Wars, where they created a mess. I mean, it was getting close to becoming another Electric Wars situation where everything got destroyed. And finally, there were some agreements made. And in 246,000 BC, the Maharaji, which are the blue humans from Sirius B, on behalf of the Iani and the founders, brought in the Emerald Covenant restatement, which was brought in the information about the Emerald Covenant again, brought in the CDD plates, and said, any of you, be you hybrid or not, if you want to join the Emerald Covenant, you can. So this is when we were given the last set of CDD plates, the ones that we're drawing information from now. They were given in 246,000 BC. Now, interestingly, all of the angelic humans agreed to, yes, of course we want to do Emerald Covenant. We've always been Emerald Covenant. But the Toth Enki Anunnaki decided to go over into the Emerald Covenant at that period. So that was 246,000 BC, when Toth, as a being, Toth was an Anunnaki being, entered the Emerald Covenant for bioregenesis to get their DNA template back. Now, Toth went through, as a person, went through his own levels of bioregenesis, and he did very, very well. He got up to 11 strands, but he didn't get the 12th one before he bailed out and went the other way. But the Toth Enki Anunnaki races, they entered for bioregenesis, and there was a series of steps in this bioregenesis that was taken. You didn't get all of the strands healed immediately. There was a progressive integration of one strand after another that would take place over numerous generations to slowly build up the pattern of the D12, the angelic human hybrid strand would be put into the Anunnaki strands. What it would do is if you look at the strands, is one angelic human strand had all the natural mathematics of the divine blueprint that goes with this time matrix. The Anunnaki strand had it all in reverse and didn't have 12, units. Okay, so we have 12 units in one angelic human strand. They only had 11 units. The draconian ones only had 10 units in each strand. So they had to progressively, for each strand, build up a 12 subharmonic pattern where they'd get that extra back and reverse it back to its natural mathematics before they would be compatible with the frequencies in the natural time matrix, before they could run the divine blueprint frequencies again. So this was what this experiment was about. It wasn't an experiment to see what had happened. It was an experiment that was done, a healing experiment that had the objective of healing this particular group of Anunnaki who decided to go into the Emerald Covenant. In 208,216 BC, this was a stellar activation cycle, and consistently with the rest of our history, during every stellar activation cycle, there's an invasion of some sort, and there was a Drac invasion this time, and it created what was called the Fall of Brennaway. This was when, literally, in doing the round tables, all right, the rainbow round tables that the guardian races were always appointed to do to run the Templar here in order to assist the planet in grounding the Stargate frequencies. They were infiltrated and invaded, and the rounds began being run in reverse because people were careless, and there was a lot of intermarrying between Nephidim, draconian hybrids that supposedly were being good guys now working the Emerald Covenant, and angelic human races. And angelic humans didn't realize that they were getting code reversals in their DNA template, so when they ran the rounds, they ran them in reverse. And there's a major pole shift that took place in that period because, again, the gates had to be shut. They had to be shut, or our whole template, Earth's template, would have gone into phantom matrix completely. So in 208,216 BC is when we lost our ability to run D12 frequency, because what's called the stellar bridge, which is that frequency spiral, the Merkaba spiral of the universal level, that spirals the frequency down from D12 through all the universal gates to us, it's supposed to anchor on what's called a 12-code pulse. 12-code pulse means every dimensional frequency band has 12 subharmonics. It didn't. It anchored on a 10-code pulse, and they blocked the other part out with the reversal of the round tables. So from that point on, we were like sitting ducks here because we didn't have D12 frequency available. We only had D10 frequency available. That means we couldn't reset anything with the divine blueprint without the D12 frequency to come in and reset it. So after this, there was, life went on. There was a pole shift, and there was the races during these times were taken into the inner earth, like the angelic human races, and any of the hybrid races that could sustain the strand activation will be taken into inner earth and allowed to hang out there until it stabilized on the surface. Then they'd be brought back out. And the angelic humans were always reseated on the 24 sites, the 12 Q sites and the 12 Stargate sites. That was their home, and their DNA is literally keyed to those grids. So we all have literally a place on the planet that we belong to, and it technically belongs to us. We belong to each other. All right. Now, in 155,000 BC, this is when the Anunnaki bioregenesis program begins in full. Now, way back in 246,000 BC is when the Tothenki group entered the Emerald Covenant, but it wasn't until 155,000 BC, because of all the chaos that was going on, that it actually began, where the hybridization program began. And the Lucas Neanderthal races, because they had a little bit of the human imprint, were used as the base species for this hybridization. So the Lucas Neanderthal were combined with a pattern, a piece of the DNA from another race called the Hibernian humans. The Hibernian humans had to do with seeding too, and certain races that were created through hybridizing between human and Anunnaki races. They were a type of Nephilim, actually, Nephilim human, but they were of the Ruby order that were trying to get their full imprint back originally. So upgrade number 1, they went from Locust Neanderthal to what are called the Luhari, which was Cro-Magnon 1. And then in 152,000 BC, the Luhari hybrids were crossed with the Urantia Urtite cloister humans, and upgrade 2 is done, and they created the Iluli Levi. Here we get the races of Levi and such. This is where we get the word Leviathan. Now, the Iluli Levi, Cro-Magnon 2, was the first one of the hybrids that was capable of natural procreation with a human, where it could actually conceive a child and bear a living child with a human. The others were still not genetically compatible to that degree, where fertilization would most often not occur, and if it did, it would be highly mutated and it would die. The child could not be born by them. This began the chaos, technically speaking, because if you now have a hybrid race, and if you get a hold of that hybrid race and you're a fallen angelic, and you know that race can now naturally procreate, all you have to do is have your hybrid race rape humans, and you will create progressively more of your own in human form. And this is what began the craziness that became the Leviathan invasion. But the bioregenesis continued for the races. The Tothenki groups were still a part of this. They were still working with it. And the Tothenki groups are interesting because, remember how I said before, they were of the Anu Seraphim, which means they were Anunnaki combined with certain of the fallen Seraphim, which were the Draconians or the Reptilians. So they could actually, by using their DNA, they could actually allow for both Draconian races to incarnate into them and Anunnaki races. So it was a hybrid form that could be used to do bioregenesis for both fallen Seraphim races like the Draconians or Reptilians and fallen Anu Elohim races like the Anunnaki. That was also part of the downfall because both of them could infiltrate that race, therefore. All right. So 152,000 BC, we had Cro-Magnon II, the Eluli Levi races. From the Eluli Levi races, it went up from there. 151,000 BC, upgrade 3 was done. Eluli Levi became Eluli Judah. This is where we get the races that were transposed in our biblical text. They're not our tribes of Israel. These are the tribes of the Leviathan, and they were not part of those original biblical texts. The original 12-tribe human races were part of those original texts, and they transposed their race identity and their records into our books. Okay, 150,000 BC, there's a mess, but we had a glacial period after that one because the Jehovian Anunnaki attacked here and tried to take over, but they didn't win. But they crashed the firmaments, which are called hydrosuspension fields, that controlled the planetary climate. We actually had planetary climate control at various periods where you could, kind of like your car or your house, you set it on climate control, how much humidity you want, what temperature you want, that kind of thing. You can do that with the crystal pylon temples of inner earth, of the, Eka line. They can modulate the frequencies here in a way that through our gates we can get climate control. And when they're working properly. So in the Jehovian wipeout in 150,000 BC, we had a glacial period because a large part of our firmaments, or the hydrosuspension fields, collapsed. 148,000 BC, the next upgrade was done. The upgrade 4 created the Eluli Nephi races, and then there was a whole bunch of these guys, the Nephi races, that were infiltrated by Jehovian Anunnaki and created the what are called the Nephites. This is why certain teachings say, hail the return of the Nephites. They're supposed to be coming back in this time period. Not something to hail unless you're looking forward to becoming a Jehovian Anunnaki. And these large numbers of these have joined the Wesedek groups, from this history forward. So the return of the Nephites has to do with the return of the Metatronic coding. Here we go again. Every stage of this hybridization program had its pros and its cons. Meaning pros, that it was actually serving the purpose it was intended for the ones who stayed in the Emerald Covenant, the Toth groups, then other ones that came in. One of the ones that came in later, I believe, in fact, in this period, I think, this is the first period they came in, 148,000 BC, the being called Enoch, who had been an ascended master, and the good guy side had come in and incarnate specifically through the Jehovian Anunnaki fallen pattern to be able to try to bring them back up into bioregenesis. The Enoch crew got involved, and these were the Arcturian Jehovian Anunnaki races from the Arcturus system, from Orion and Arcturus, and they were different from the Pleiadian Nibiruan ones, and they tended to not like each other very much. They got involved with the Nephi level. They came into the experiment at the Nephi level. And so then you had two groups of Leviathan race, Leviathan because they're all out of Levi, but usually we use Leviathan in terms of the Illuminati, what became the Illuminati. But there were two branches of these hybrid races that were created. One were the sons of Belial, and the others were the sons of Zadok. All right. And these are... which were the reversals of, they were originally the sons of Lilib, the Lilibim, which were Toth's crew, the ones that were on the good side. And this is where you get like the Lilith mythologies that come out of that, and the Zadokim or the Kodazim, and they actually reversed the letters once groups of them became, fallen. They reversed them, so you had the Lilibim turned into the sons of Belial, and you had the Kodazim becoming the sons of Zadok. And these became prominent figures in the Atlantean period. I mean, at this point, we're still not into the height of Atlantean culture yet. Atlantean civilization really didn't come into being until, let's see, when was it? When the Atlantean root race was seeded. Atlantis was, the place was there, the cloister races were there, but it wasn't technically called Atlantis. That was a root race. It was a smaller race than the human cloister races that were coming in. It was a smaller branch of the human races. So anyway, this is the step-by-step process that the Leviathan or the Illuminati races were created from. They were progressively crossed, and the idea was to get them up to strand 5, where they would take the reverse 11 DNA pattern and work strand 1 all the way up to strand 5 into non-reversal through the hybridization. At that point, they could pass through Stargate 5 into the Terran time field in density 2. You could get them out of here, and they could continue their evolution from there to get the next set of strands. But all along, every step of the way, there were raider races, fallen angelics, that came in and grabbed portions of them and hybridized with them and then used them as tools to create their little armies where they would go raid other villages. I mean, it's still, even in our recorded history, it's classic, the plundering of one group that conquers another. They come in, they rape the women, they, trash the society, they force their belief systems on them. Well, there are continually more children being born by the raping of angelic human females. They would very often come into a village, raid it, kill the males, and rape the females, and kidnap them, keep them until they found out whether they conceived or not. And if they conceived, they would, bear the children. There's a big hatred vibe that a lot of women carry from being a part of that time period where they hate children. And when they have their own children, they don't mean to hate children, but this emotional thing comes up where there's almost a desire to kill children because there was a violation that was done in that period, like in this pre-Atlantean period, where you were being forced to carry something that somebody else forced you to get pregnant with that was not going to have a human soul. It was going to have a fallen angelic soul. They would birth dark avatars in this way, and the women that were angelic humans that were forced into this type of breeding felt not only violated, but they knew they were contributing to the potential downfall of this planet. So there was a whole movement in the female consciousness that went into killing their offspring whenever they could, because they knew the souls coming into them were not human, and they were, of the other side. So this is some of the stuff we're still healing on a deep level. Women have a lot of that, and there's an anger that was in men. They felt very emasculated in the whole situation. They come in and be killed. They didn't want them for anything because they weren't gestation chambers like females were. So there's a lot of things we're still processing from this period. The Leviathan races, by the time we got up to, let me see, where, number 5, the 5th upgrade. The 5th upgrade didn't come until 68,000 BC. That's because there was a whole lot of other crazy things, like from 148,000 BC to 75,000 BC. That's a long period of time. It was called the Anu occupation. Humans actually lived underground because the Pleiadian, Nibiru, and Anunnaki had got together and they'd come in and they'd taken over surface Earth. So they literally took over surface Earth and destroyed anything that wasn't of theirs, and were trying to either kill or kidnap and use human populations. So literally human civilization went underground. A lot of us will have cellular memory that's about that, where we'll actually remember times when we were so sensitive we could hear a footstep hundreds of feet up above us, because we lived underground. There are still many chambers that are left of the civilizations that were there, and there are other ones that were run by the negative ones as well, because there were periods when they went underground in relation to the dinoids, the dinosaur things. But anyway, because of the craziness that took place, that's a very long period of time. This is why the Anunnaki decided they owned the planet, because they come in and stole it, so they figured it's theirs. That's the typical, it's really the typical thing if you look at any of the politics that we're in the middle of right now. I mean, they're all fighting over stuff they stole from somebody else in the first place. It's like, anyway, when we get up to 68,000 BC, they finally did the last upgrade, and this was taking them from the Eluli Nephi up to the Anu Melchizedeks. This is where they were crossed with the fifth strand. They picked up the fifth angelic human DNA strand, the cloister strand of the Melchizedeks. And this is out of these guys, they end up with the Templar Melchizedeks. And the Templar Melchizedek priesthood, which is the total opposition to the cloister. Once in a while, when they decide to enter the Emerald Covenant, they actually assist. But most of the history, the Templar Melchizedeks were the ones that were the front men and beings for the Wesedeks. And there was a version of them that were also in the Phantom Matrix. So you had a division between them. One was for the Wesedek bonding, the other Metatronic bonding. The other group of them was for the Phantom bonding. But both of them were not anything to do with the Emerald Covenant. And right now, most of the Melchizedeks on the planet, the ones that woke up first, the ones that are going around and transmitting frequency to everybody and initiating them into the Melchizedek priesthood, most of them are Templars, which means most of them are Anunnaki. So, anyway, this was the progression, and I wanted the people who didn't hear this before to understand the progression of where these Leviathan Illuminati races that we talk about, where they came from. And it also answers the question of the Darwinian stuff. Where did the Neanderthal and the Cro-Magnon, where do they fit? Were these our human ancestors? No, they were not. They were the hybrid ancestors. The only connection to human they had was a little bit of human genetics that was put into their pattern to assist them to evolve to a higher level. They are not what we came out of at all. But there's been a whole movement since Atlantis. It was part of the Luciferian covenant, which was an agreement made by the fallen Anu Elohim races, the Anunnaki races, that they would progressively orchestrate something called transposition of race identity, where progressively, using radio body programming, using progressive genetic infiltration, they would transpose their race identity over the angelic human and the indigo race identity, and they would take over the planet. And taking over the planet meant bringing it into Phantom and then into Wesedek matrix. So this has been a long, long process here. This will give you some idea of how much we've all invested in this drama. There's a lot of vested interest going on here. This is why they're not going to say, oh, they're busted, they're blowing the whistle on us, they're telling on us, we'll just go away. They're not going to do that. This is the ending point of this drama and the beginning of a new series of dramas. 3 new ones, in fact, 3 new paths of Genesis. Now, from Atlantis, I want to show you really quickly. We start with the fact that you have these races, one collective of hybrids that are being run by the Thoth collective that are Pleiadian Nibiruan, and another group that came from the Nephi level and up that were run by the Enoch group. Now, the Enoch group was representative of the Jehovian Anunnaki, the ones that consider themselves the pure strains, that they weren't mixed with the Seraphim. Then you had the Thoth ones that were the Anu Seraphim, the mixed ones. So you had 4 basic groups at this point. You had the Lilibim, which were the ones of Thoths that were still on the Christos evolutionary path. And then you had the ones that were made of reversing the DNA of those guys. And they were the sons of Belial. And you had on the Enoch side the Kodazim, which were the ones still in the Christos path. And then the Zadokim, the sons of Zadok, which were the ones who went into reversal. Now, they didn't go into reversal all at once. There were experiments being made by hijacking them at every stage of evolution. But it really came to a head where the formalization of the sons of Belial and the sons of Zadok came in the Atlantean period after 25,500 BC. It began with 22,326 BC when Thoth's group went defected from the Emerald Covenant. And Thoth made deals with the Anunnaki races from Alpha and Omega Centauri. This is what you get where you get the Alpha and Omega order Melchizedek races or Melchizedeks. For anybody that knows about the Melchizedek, ordination systems, they say, we are of the Alpha Omega order. You'll also find that in books like the Enoch books, of the Alpha and the Omega. When Thoth made deals with the Alpha Omega order Wesedek Anunnaki hybrids, this is when the fire sword initiations began, which means this is when he allowed his hybrids that he was put in charge of their evolution and getting them back into the Christos pattern, he allowed them, without asking them, he allowed them to begin receiving the frequencies transmissions of the flaming blue sword of Archangel Michael, that D13 reverse current that would begin the process of reversing their whole template. That began technically in 22,340 BC, right before the 326 BC, the 22,326 BC still activation cycle. That was the beginning of bringing fully into our race line the Metatronic distortion. Now, it began there. Enoch still held out. Enoch didn't defect from the Emerald Covenant until 10,500 BC in something that was called the Luciferian Conquest, where he basically felt cornered because the Anunnaki the Weesadeks had already taken over so much here that he joined with the Thoth groups. And they together agreed to take their sons of Belial and create something called the Sons of Zadok, from reversing Enoch's people, reversing their DNA templates, and then combining them to create a master race. And they weren't the only ones. You had draconian races trying to get in on the picture. It was like, who can snatch whose bodies and make a new race strain out of it? And it was all geared toward, originally they wanted to just get it done with in 22,326 BC. Stellar activation cycle, we get the place into reversal, suck it down in the Weesadek matrix, and that's that. Have our final conflict drama, because it's either going to go into Phantom or go into Weesadek. So those guys were fighting with each other. Which way is it going to go? Because we ended up in stalemate in 22,326 BC. We're still here to talk about it. But the history that has come since that point has been horrendous. After this time frame, after Thoth had gone over and began the prying, I have to take this off. I'm getting really hot. Are you guys getting hot? Yeah, you can open the door if you want. I think it's really hot in here. Now, this is where, and I brought you up to the point where this fits in. This is what happened from Atlantis. All right? You see all those lines going down? They're different race lines. This has nothing to do with human evolution. This is the hybrid evolution of the Illuminati races. Okay? Yeah. It starts basically with several of the groups. Remember how we said we had the Enki, Enlil, and Marduk groups of the Pleiadian Nibiruans? Well, each of them created a strain by raiding the sons of Belial. All right? So it'll take me forever to try to read all of this. You had the Thoth Enki group. You had the Enlil group, which were Enlil Odedicron, so they were had more reptilian coding to them. You had the Marduk races, and these are called the Marduk Luciferians, and then you had the Marduk Satanes. This is where you get Lucifer and Satan. These were combined. They were family lines that combined with different things in the off-planet, in their home environments, and then took those gene codes and put them down into here, into the Leviathan races. So we ended up with a huge line of both Anunnaki. Oh, another one of them is the Samjaze Luciferian Anunnaki, which are the Pleiadian ones. So if you hear, it's funny, there's, I think, a person named Billy Meyer that's had contact with Samjaze the Pleiadian, and she comes down in her spaceship to visit. Well, guess where she lives? She lives in the Pleiades. She's one of these guys. These were the beginnings of the primary Atlantean king lines, the Leviathan or Illuminati king lines. There were also the Drac side, or the ones that were of the fallen Seraphim races. You had the Necromaton and Drami, which were ones that were one of the first combined with Weesadek, where you had the Andrami races that were they were Jehovian Anunnaki, and they combined with the Necromaton. And they combined with the Weesadeks to form the Necromaton. When you get into who combined with who and where'd you get Drac or where'd you get Anunnaki, it gets confusing, because there were a bunch of Weesadek races that were hybridized with, say, Omicron Draconian, and then that taken and hybridized with Anunnaki. The more codes you could collect, the better your master invader race would be. So we ended up with a group called the Necromaton and Drami ones, the Odedicron reptilian ones that kept pretty much the purest train Odedicron ones. Some of them went bad as far as, even though they started out as a race that fell that didn't really mean to, some of them went into complete fall, where they began to make that choice to stay fallen. So there are reptilians that chose to fall at this point. There are also the Omicron Draconians, or the Dragon Moths. Okay? Now, each of them created a whole line of beings that progress. There's, on this side, when we get this chart done, there's like dates over here as to who became what when, and then it shows which branched off and which combined with what to create the next level. Yeah, I mean, the most important ones that I wanted to bring up here have to do with the Atlantean, the basic Atlantean king lines. There were a group, there was 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There were basically 5 groups that were involved with the Palladian Nibiruan crew. They were the Sathians, the Ilulcum, the Idiruans, the Lilithan, and the Azuriel. Various ones of them combined to form what became known as the Atlantean king lines. The Enlil Odedicron were the ones who were the Idiruans. They evolved to become the Nohasa Atalan king line. So you have an Atalan king line. You will also have, as we come down, an Atlas king line, an Osiris king line, a Larsa king line. And the Larsa kings, they found evidence and lists. The Larsa king lists were tablets that were found in Sumeria. So this stuff plugs right in to the archaeological evidence they managed to miss when they were doing their house cleaning in 9558 BC. Out of these lines, which it would probably take me another hour to try to go down and show you where everybody, comes out. When we get down to time period, Venus and Romulus are in here where Rome started. Now on this side, anyway, I'll just show you. In this section of the graph, okay, coming down, like straight down from this area over here toward the middle. Okay, would you please? Thank you. Over here you basically have the ones that were from the Toth lineage. And over here you have, in the middle, all right, over here you have more of the Toth lineage. Coming down this way you have ones that were the Enoch lineage. And then over here you have ones that were the Draconian ones, the Odedicron reptilian and the Draconian ones. So literally these created, every one of them created their Antichristos king lines, their Antichristos grail lines. And they came from Atlantis, and when we get up to certain points, there's certain interesting points in history here. Let me see, I wanted to get, where's Rome? 5900 BC, that's before. 700 BC, where is that? Okay, in here we basically have time periods such as, all right, the 9558B flood. That was a contrived flood that was orchestrated by the members of the Luciferian Covenant. The Luciferian Covenant was run by all of these guys, the Tothian Anunnaki, the Palladian Nibiruan Anunnaki crew. And Enoch at that point had entered the Luciferian Covenant, which means he brought his race lines into the Metatronic coding, and it also meant he started to participate, and his races started to participate in the attempted hijack of the planet. Part of the Luciferian Covenant, which was originally founded in 10,500 BC, part of that was to stage a wipeout and a house cleaning, where once certain things were done to the memory banks here, in the planetary memory banks, once the Nibiruan diotic crystal grid thing that was set up at Stonehenge, once that was pumping enough of the program through the grids, there would be an erase time where we get rid of the history and the races, whatever races that they didn't particularly want. In 9558 BC was the period of time that they used the crystal generators, because at this point we still had Atlantean technology. You had massive selenite crystal rods that were positioned under the ocean beds in various regions connected to the stargates and those kind of things. And they used them to collapse part of the firmaments again. And this created, it wasn't the biggest flood that's ever been here. It wasn't the great, great deluge. But it was large enough to allow for, created a small amount of pole shift. That's where we got our wobble from. You know how the planet has its wobble. Well, that's where the wobble came from. It was already out of alignment from the other messes that had taken place before, but that was the last one. Now, in 9558 BC, there was spaceships flying all over the place, because the ones that they wanted to preserve were taken into shelter. Our guys knew it was coming and we couldn't stop it. So we literally got as many of the angelic humans into the inner earth as could come. And at that point, at least they had some DNA left to play with. You know, like right now, we're much more mutated in the DNA than we were at that point. The mutations had been started, but they hadn't been fully finished by then. So in 9558 BC, we had our house cleaning and our records cleaned out. Literally, the history records were taken, were destroyed, so we wouldn't have any reference. And progressively, the survivors after this point, there was still the knowledge. The Grail line, the true Grail line races and the angelic humans knew. They remembered what the history was. They knew the Atlantean history, and that was a problem, because there were genetic alterations through the fire sword initiations that were being done on the Leviathan races that made them progressively not be able to remember anything except the Metatronic programming. So it was like their radial bodies were being plugged in and fed the CD player or the CD, the CD-ROM program that was being run from the Metatronic WISADEC system. They were losing their memory. Their memory was being literally recoded right in their own DNA. But it wasn't affecting the angelic humans to that degree. They still remembered. They were still a problem. And they were going around teaching the Leviathan races, remembering them, helping them to wake up and remember. You don't want to do this. You really don't. This is why you don't remember. This is how it is. And a lot of the Leviathan races were coming back into the Emerald Covenant, which meant the fallen angelics were losing their foot soldiers. So there was a progressive series of things done from 9558 BC, the big one culminating in 3470 BC. Where is that? That's up here. Where there was a final shift in the magnetic fields on the planet that literally shut down everybody's DNA. It created a temporary, like if you shut your computer off and had to reboot, and when it rebooted, half of it was turned off. So literally, even the angelic humans lost their full memory banks at that point. They'd already taken the written records away in 9558 BC, and they got rid of monuments. They got rid of, literally, awesome buildings. There used to be beautiful Atlantean temples and those kind of things that are nothing like the pieces of stuff that are fallen down that we see now as ruins. These, I mean, really, there's something really been lost in the translation after the flood period as far as architecture. But that's because we haven't had the power of, say, the Ankhs and those kind of things. The Ankhs were a technology that was standard in Atlantis, and if we remember the Crux and Seda field that's formed with the Merkaba field. The Ankhs were tools that could actually generate small fields like that, so you could do all sorts of things with them. Once the flood had occurred and things were, basically the Anunnaki were taking over the planet again, those tools were taken into Earth and not allowed back out here because too much damage could be done with them. So we were back on manual, where you had to like lift blocks to move them, like with your hands instead of levitate them with a little handy little Ankh. So anyway, this whole progression, you have 9558 BC flood, the 3470 BC, we call that that was recorded in the Bible as the Tower of Babel thing, is the Babylon massacre, because we've been babbling on ever since. That's when they scrambled the languages. That's when we lost our cellular memory, and that's when they began to really amalgamate the races, where now angelic humans didn't remember anymore that they were different. Perfect place to get the Grail lines in, where they're clueless and we can direct them. So from this point on, we have been guided. We come up into more recent history. In through this period, now in through this period, from like, what are the dates on this? 700 and something. Actually, it starts around 1100 BC. We get into like the beginning formations of what became the Roman Empire and those kind of things. These were all invader empires. The Egyptian Empire was an invader empire. Pharaohs were not part of the Christic pattern. They were the Anunnaki raider races that came in here. We look and we go, oh, aren't they pretty temples and all this kind of stuff when we go over to Egypt and check out the stuff. If we knew the history on them, we wouldn't be so impressed. They're evidence, living evidence of the invasion of this planet by Anunnaki races. So in through this section we have where the Roman culture began, when the natural people, the Stargate 5 people, that were the original Greek and Roman, peoples, were invaded, and progressively transposition of race identity was done to them. They were either killed if they wouldn't cooperate, and they were hybridized to progressively infiltrate the Leviathan gene code into into their stock, into their genetic stock. This happened literally at different times within every culture on this planet. It was planned and it was orchestrated. And right now, what's on the planet is the product of this. We have the creation of Rome. Down here we get into fun stuff where we get into like the Jesus story. And we find out that Abraham's line came through from this section over here. It was when some of the Toth group, some of the sons of Belial and the sons of Zadok combined down here to create what was called the Hyksos. The Hyksos kings, they're also in our written history. They don't know much about them, but the Hyksos they ended up doing a transposition of race identity on the Hebrew lines and also in various other ones. But Abraham was one of those. So all of the descendants of Abraham were originally Hyksos. Abraham had nothing to do with the Hebrew peoples. The tribes that are listed in the Bible right now have nothing to do with the angelic human history. We've literally had an alien race come in here and transpose over our history records and our identity, mess with our DNA, wipe out our memory via the planetary magnetic fields, and literally make us think that we're their children. Our history was very different than this. So this chart is interesting because it shows you all sorts of things. It shows you the invasion, how the various cultures were invaded and hybridized, and their gene code progressively diluted and turned into reversal through forced hybridization with these raider races. It happened to the Celts. It happened to everybody at different times. The Hindus got it in 5,900 BC. I mean, it was just like, if you look, once this chart is done, it's going to be really phenomenal. But this is what got us up to the present moment. I wish I had this chart large, but this is probably a month's worth of work just to get this on something readable and large enough to read. This was the product of probably about 6 months worth of translation off the CDD plates of different pieces of data, because it didn't come through the chart. These charts don't come through. I have to design the charts after the data comes through in words. I have to take those words and put them in pictures so they make sense, so you can see things. And this is why they take so long sometimes. If they just showed me a picture and I could close my eyes and copy it, it would be much, much easier. Doesn't work that way. So the information on here is a summarization of all the information for about 6 months that have been given with like huge context around it as far as the different Leviathan races and how they have progressively moved into the dominating force on this planet. They are the ones that control the politics here. They are the ones that control religion here. They are, and they have been since 9558 BC. So we are facing a situation, the magnitude of which is mind-blowing when you're coming from the mind control program. It just seems so outrageous and so impossible. The closest you can get is watching like the Sci-Fi Channel, where you see these wacky things happening, creeps from black hole come and try to invade the world kind of thing. You can translate it into science, or you can translate it into spirituality. You can call them fallen angelics coming from the pit, this was foretold in the Bible. What was left of the Bible even kept that content. They said there would be the beast that came out of the pit. They said all sorts of things. Now, we've had other workshops where we talked about the seven seals, and we've talked about the horsemen, the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, and what those really are. So there is a truth to parts of the Bible, and there's also a great deception in how that truth has been presented, because it's been presented in riddles and rhymes, where beasts are things that we imagine to be big green things with 7 heads and 10 horns and a crown on each of the 10 horns that rise up out of the ocean, out of the pit. We don't think in terms of sci-fi technologies that have the ability to move planetary systems. We don't think of black holes. We have this romanticized fairy tale that we've been given to cloak the reality of what's taken place. And so many people have dedicated their lives for so many centuries now to uphold those fairy tales. They don't know how to let go. The fairy tale started in Atlantis, and they started with the creation of the Leviathan races that we talked about yesterday. I went through the process, the progression of from 155,000 BC, how the 5 different stages of the bioregenesis program for the Leviathan, for the Anunnaki races had been done here, and how progressively each stage had been raided by different ones that were not of the Emerald Covenant. What that created by the time we were in mid-Atlantis, let's say about 63,000 BC, which is around the time that the angelic human Atlantean root race was seeded. First came cloister races. This is where the word cloister comes from. The cloister races were the ones that had, they were the indigos. They were the ones that had the higher strand coding. They were the Lyran Syrians and the Gaian Orifeme humans. They came first, the cloister races. And from the cloister races came what's called the Turinicium II race, which was another version of the 12-strand angelic human race. This is where Atlanteans and Lemurians and those guys fit in. They were, if you take the indigos, then the smaller gene code from them that came out was the angelic human 12-strand. From those came smaller breakdowns of the strand content. Lemurians, Atlanteans, those kind of things. They had the potential, all of them, for 12-strand, but they would have a certain amount activated at birth. So we had our races on planet. They were the ones appointed here. They were the guardians of this place. But once the Leviathan races began to be genetically interwoven with our race, all hell broke loose, quite literally. And we are living the tail end of that firestorm that began in Atlantis. You hear little romantic versions of, yeah, there was this advanced civilization called Atlantis, but they abused the crystalline technologies, and we think, oh, maybe they blew up a few things with some big crystals. What they have done with the sacred crystalline technologies is absolutely, there are no words to describe the level of perversion of what's been done here. They've genetically raped a race. They have raped the grids of a planet, and not just a planet. They have progressively, as I showed you in the cube matrix structure, where they have literally taken the Stargate system here and the Stargate system in Phantom and plugged it into another Stargate. These are the potentialities of crystalline-based technology, by the way. I mean, it was brilliant. What was done here was absolutely evil, but absolutely brilliant. Now, ultimately, good does prevail. That's the way Source set it up here. However, there is a huge scale of allowance. It's like a pendulum that swings. When it goes to a certain level of perversion of the original plan, it will begin to swing back. We are in that point now where it has the cycles of evolution through this time matrix have swung. The cosmic cycle has gone to its extreme of negative, where if it went any further, it would take down the entire structure of this time matrix. And the time matrix was built in a way that that wasn't going to be allowed. So it will rebalance itself with bringing in the D12 frequency, with bringing in the divine blueprint. What that means is we're in prime time for the final conflict drama. That is what is taking place right now. And most of the people on the planet are walking around clueless. They haven't an idea that this is going on. People follow the New Age movement, have no clue what they pick up when they go into a room, for example. They don't realize they're getting astral field implantation that's going to activate more of the reverse matrix codings just by going to a workshop. One of the worst places I've ever seen is the New York City Expo. We went there, and I was appalled the first time. I just went to sit in on somebody's workshop. You know, it was, oh my, it was their free lecture. You know, 100 people in the audience. And because I had the high sight on, and I wasn't trying. I was trying to turn it off, in fact. And if it wasn't for the beloveds kind of sitting over my shoulder going, no, you're not going to leave. Sit there. We need you to hold frequency. Right? I wanted to get up and run, because what I saw were these forms coming into the room, and people are oblivious. They don't see them, but the guy running the workshop knew they were coming in, and he's, you know, doing his thing, teaching people, and these things are coming in the room and astral cording all of the people in the room. And what they had, when I saw that, I wanted to literally get out. My skin, I was like a porcupine with its spines out. Get me out of here. And Ma had said to me, no, we need you. You're all right. You know, you're fine. Stay and run frequency. And they had me run Maharic Seal, and they had me projected into the room. And it was amazing, because I watched the cords start dropping. And it really, really aggravated both the speaker, who zeroed in on me at the back of the room. He could feel where it was coming from. But the stuff that's going on is amazing right now. And people don't know. People that go to churches think this is a good thing. If they knew what the churches were built to do, they would have a different feeling about churches. Once upon a time, there were holy temples, and even if there were no buildings standing, the holy temples were the people who carried the living presence of God with them, consciously and fully. We were the living temples. Whether or not we had a building to put our bodies in didn't matter. This planet was once a living temple. It's been a temple that's been run dry, and it's going to rebel quite soon, because it will rebalance itself too. If It's kind of like part of the planetary immune system. If a disease or a virus gets too strong, it will eventually kick up the immune system. This planet won't let itself be fully destroyed. So anyway, I'm going to take us back really quick to Atlantis, to after the Leviathan races were created. All right, they were created over a period of numerous generations that began in 155,000 BC and then moved up to 63,000 BC, where at the last phase, or the giving of the fifth angelic human strand into the Leviathan pattern, was done. This created the Anu Melchizedek race. The Anu Melchizedek race had, it was the first one that actually looked similar to the angelic human races, because they looked more ape-like. Some of them looked more combination of ape and reptilian-like. They didn't look like humans because they weren't humans, and they came out of the Neanderthal pattern. So they were like strange versions of that. But as they progressively picked up more, after generations and generations, more of the angelic human DNA strand, they started to look more like human beings. Now, angelic humans in those days were very tall. They were, some of them were, you know, really, on planet, about 6 to 9 feet tall was about the average in those periods, because there was already genetic mutation that was keeping the height down. But this is the point where we began a downward spiral of evolution that we're living the end of today. Now, there were several primary groups of beings, fallen angelics, that invaded. You have basically, we talked about the Anu Elohim, that from the original fall, they were Anu Elohim. They appointed themselves as the false creator gods. They created the Anunnaki lineage. And you had the fallen seraphim races that were the Draconians, and then some of the Odedicron races that were reptilian got mixed in with them. The Seraphi also create bird people. All right, the original Christos founders races created different types of forms. The Anu Elohim, before they were Anu Elohim, had created the aquatic ape hominid type form. And the Elohai Elohim, the ones of the Emerald Order, were hominid felines. They had the large feline-like eyes. They were the Lyran. That was the original Lyran founders pattern, and actually all of the others came out of that pattern. So it was feline. There's some people that call them the Leonines, which were kind of like a downstepped later evolution of them. But when we look at the little forms running around here on the planet, we have bugs, we have mammals, we have all sorts of things. They all came from one of these primary 3 creator god collectives, one of the 3 Christos founders races. So when we're dealing with the Leviathan fallen ones, we basically have 2 places that they all came out of, aside from the Wesedex. They were a completely different matrix. They were actually, you know how we have our Eka maps that takes us all the way up to the first level of creation in our matrix? Well, there's a parallel to that, where we have that whole system of our Akasha Ea. There is a parallel Akasha Ea that's linked to us, that we didn't even bother trying to expand the graph that big, because once we get through our own, we're home and in full expansion. The Wesedex are coming, they're infiltrating this one from the parallel of literally the cosmic cluster. They call the Akasha Ea the Ruche cluster, that it's a cluster of universes or reality fields, and that's the pattern that all reality fields that have manifestation will take. So aside from the Wesedex, there were primarily 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, primarily 9 different invader races. All of those 9 invader races came out of either the Anu Elohim and their Anunnaki lineage, or the Seraphi Seraphim fallen ones and their Draconian dragon moth lineage. So they were, if you took them home to their creator gods, it would be the dragon moths and the Anu Elohim aquatic ape things. Now, the Anu Elohim created, when they created the Anunnaki, the first Anunnaki form was a bipedal dolphin. They're called the bipedal dolphin people. And that was, they're the Jehovian Anunnaki. They consider themselves the supreme Anunnaki, and the other ones that mixed with the Seraphi are considered, you know, lesser than them, and they don't tend to not like each other. But they're working together right now with the United Resistance. But anyway, in Atlantis, you had these different branches of the fallen ones. You had one group, and it's important here because there's some words. We find out where the Adam races came from. What's the story about Adam and Eve and all that stuff? Well, we start to understand when we start to see the names and who came out of what once the Leviathan raids were orchestrated here. Now, when we get into the Anunnaki races, we primarily have the Nibiru and Anunnaki, the Palladian Anunnaki, and those two groups work together a lot. They're also in other systems, but they're the primary strongholds. These are called the Luciferian Anunnaki, and there's a reason for the term Luciferian. First of all, they're not Jehovian. All right, the Jehovian are the bipedal dolphin people, pure straight Anunnaki. These are the ones that are combined with the Seraphim, fallen draconian, or some of the reptilian or Dodecron races to, form a hybrid strain. Now you have the Enki, Enlil, and Marduk groups were the primary ones of the Anu Seraphim Anunnaki races. There was one group of the Enki, they're called the Enki Zephelium races, that combined with another group of the Marduk Satane family races. This is where we get the word Satan from. It's referring to one of the draconian hybrids of the Anu Seraphim. They combined with one of the more reptilian hybrid Anu Seraphim, the Enki groups. So you take a Toth Enki Zephelium and you combined it with a Marduk. Another name for this group is the Marduk Draman. It's not the Draman, the Dragon Queen ones. You combine in the Satane family of those. You combine that, you get a Luciferian. The Luciferian imprint was used to upgrade. They considered it upgrading the Nibiruan and the Palladian Anunnaki races. So you have the Palladian Nibiruan Anunnaki, who are the Luciferians. The Toth groups fit into this. Toth is one of the shining stars of the, yes, he almost made it to Christendom again, Christendom. But so there's that group. They have three primary raider races that became involved with the Leviathans here. One of them, the ones from the Palladian system, from Alcyone, which is Tara, which is Earth's counterpart in density 2, are called the Samjaze Luciferian Anunnaki. Okay, they are also the Palladians. They're the blondes, the pretty blondes. There's some dark-haired ones, but they're ones they like to put on display and contact people and things. So the angelic, they're very Nordic looking. They have very pretty features because they stole them from the Procyonies. The image that they wear is something they got genetically when they invaded and genetically took over the Ceres Procyon race, who were blondes, but they were angelic human type blondes. So you have the Samjazi Luciferians. You have the Toth Enki Zephelium groups, which are the Nibiruan Anunnaki. That's the Nibiruan royal elite there. They're the ones that really tried to take over Rome from the Dracs. The eight-pointed in certain periods. The eight-pointed star is the sign of Nibiru. It's also the sign of the fixed phase-locked Merkaba, and a lot of other system and agreements. A group called the Marduk Luciferian Anunnaki, and they were a draconian group of the Anu Seraphim hybrid Anunnaki. These are affiliated with the Alpha Centauri. So this is where you get the Alpha and Omega Centauri people coming into it. Then you also have the Jehovian Anunnaki, who don't like these guys. Jehovian Anunnaki, these are the pure strain. The Raider would destroy the Orphim races. Once the Wesedek could go through to this matrix. And the Orphim were created after the Azarites